I feel old in saying that this story goes back to 1977. I'd been involved in the environmental community as an undergrad, and I came back from the Peace Corps, where I'd been in Africa doing salt marsh ecology, and went to grad school. I was in Africa doing fish culture, and I came back to grad school to study salt marsh ecology. And like most people in the mid-late 70s who were studying biology, I was very concerned about what was publicly called the limits of growth. The environmental community and particularly environmental scientists were becoming acutely aware that we would eventually bump up against some very profound limits to the growth of our civilization on the planet Earth. I'm not among those who think that we are close to the limits of growth. I actually think that we're quite some distance. But we do eventually get there, and it's kind of a depressing thing to talk about. And what would eventually become called sustainable development. Those ideas were floating around in the community, and having lived in the third world, I saw it for the nonsense that it really is. Sustainable development is an oxymoron. People in the third world don't want to be poor, and we don't want to live like they live. There's good reasons that they want to be rich and live like us. And the idea that we can somehow go back to a imagined, balance with nature is just absurd. There are already too many of us on the planet to do that. Unless you're willing to watch people die by the billions, then, we don't, that's not really an option. And, and I really felt like, I think probably the majority of people studying ecology at the time felt that it was kind of a hopeless situation. And then I read The High Frontier. A professor mentioned it to the class, and I went and got a copy, and I was like up all night reading The High Frontier. And a lot of what people remember from the book The High Frontier is what Dr. O'Neill had to say about space colonies and these big cities in space, and that stuff's cool, I suppose. But what really got me is what he said about the environment. And that he pointed out that the Earth's not a closed system. Something which I totally understood. I knew that there were inputs, and I'm studying this stuff, right? I knew about it. But that we could go out and use the resources of the solar system to protect Earth's fragile environment was not an idea that anyone had ever mentioned to me. It was just like, oh, that's sort of obvious. And it was such a mind change. It's like, a Copernican revolution, like inside my own head. It was really quite dramatic. All of a sudden, I was no longer living on the Earth in a closed system. I was living in the solar system, in an open system. And we suddenly had adequate resources to have, freedom and prosperity and all the kinds of good things that I liked about our civilization for thousands of years to come. But there was some mistakes in the book. Nobody was going to write a book that doesn't have mistakes. And one that kind of bothered me was his attitude. It was the image he had of agriculture in these space colonies. They were, people would have these nice little gardens next to their house, and there'd be these hydroponic gardens and people living in these little green places, and it's all very pretty. And I'd been trained to be a high-tech farmer, right? I knew that made no sense. A good environment for plants is not a good environment for people, and vice versa. For one thing, plants like really high CO2 environments. They don't much like oxygen. They make oxygen. It's a waste product for them. We're the other way around. And if you have the opportunity to put the plants, the agricultural zone in one pressure vessel and the animals in a different pressure, I mean, you certainly want some plants, house plants, but you don't want agriculture. People in rural America don't raise their family on the farm. They work on the farm. The family lives in town because the farm's not a healthy place for your children. And anyway, so I wrote Jerry a letter where I laid this out. I said, you just got it wrong. And he sent me back this wonderful short note, which I'm embarrassed to admit I have long since lost, saying, yeah, you're not the first person to point this out. You're undoubtedly right. But I've decided that my mission is spreading the vision of this, and this is the easier vision to sell. And I immediately knew this was a guy I wanted to meet. So the first school break I had, I got in the car, drove up to Princeton, and I met Jerry, and he recruited me. I left the environmental movement, and I've been involved in the space community ever since.
What year was that?
That would have been, I guess, early '78. And around the same time, I dropped out of grad school. I did decide that I was not a scientist. It's not that I didn't want to become a scientist. I was not a scientist. I was never going to become one. It was not me. And I went to business school instead, and I haven't regretted either of those decisions ever since. And so I got to know Dr. O'Neill, and I'm very privileged to have had a personal relationship with him, and was involved in the Space Studies Institute, which he founded for many years after that.